15. Black celebrities who enjoy pain and self-harm. They had talent fame and the world watching, but behind the applause was a quiet war no one wanted to see. These weren't stories of failure. They were stories of endurance pushed too far where pain became routine and silence felt safer than asking for help. Today we're pulling back the curtain on the hidden cost of Black excellence, the moments when success didn't save them but slowly broke them. If you think fame guarantees happiness, this video will challenge everything you believe. Watch closely, stay with us to the end, and join the conversation. This is Legends of Black Excellence. J.J. Johnson. J.J. Johnson was not simply a respected jazz trombonist. He was a structural architect of modern bebop. Rising in the 1940s, he transformed an instrument once viewed as clumsy into one capable of speed, precision, and intellectual depth. His phrasing matched the agility of saxophones, earning admiration from peers like Charlie Parker and Miles Davis. Over decades, Johnson recorded influential albums, wrote film scores, and mentored younger musicians, establishing a reputation built on discipline and restraint, rather than spectacle. To audiences, he appeared controlled, methodical, and emotionally impenetrable. That image, however, masked a difficult final chapter. When Johnson gradually stepped away from touring in the late 1980s, the disappearance of routine left him increasingly isolated. Music had structured his days for over 40 years, and without it, time became heavy and unmarked. In 1995, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, a development that deeply unsettled him. Fear of prolonged physical decline and dependence weighed heavily on his mind. Instead of leaning on community, Johnson retreated inward, adopting habits that quietly wore his body down: frequent drinking, constant smoking, skipped meals, and weeks spent alone in his studio. When creative purpose fades, where does a lifetime of discipline turn next? This was not reckless self-destruction, but slow erosion. Johnson had defeated heroin addiction earlier in life, proving remarkable resilience. Yet aging illness and solitude combined into a form of suffering that felt inescapable. Hospital visits increased as respiratory problems emerged, and each discharge returned him to deeper loneliness. Friends noticed his withdrawal, but he resisted intervention, guarding his independence at all costs. By 2001, mental exhaustion overtook endurance, and Johnson ended his life with a firearm. J.J. Johnson's legacy remains foundational to jazz history, but his death reveals a quieter truth. Self-harm does not always announce itself loudly, sometimes hidden. Dave Duerson. Dave Duerson was once the embodiment of toughness and intelligence in professional football. As a hard-hitting safety, he helped define one of the most dominant defenses in NFL history, with the Chicago Bears earning 4 Pro Bowl selections and a Super Bowl title in the 1985 season. Known for his discipline and leadership, Duerson built a reputation as a player who thrived under pressure. Off the field, his Notre Dame education and post-retirement business roles reinforced the image of a man who had successfully transitioned beyond the game. Over time, however, the physical cost of football began to surface. During an era with limited awareness of head trauma, Duerson absorbed countless collisions that slowly altered his brain. By his 40s, he experienced chronic headaches, memory loss, mood swings, and episodes of uncontrollable anger. Those closest to him noticed a growing emotional volatility that contrasted sharply with his earlier composure. Financial challenges and a divorce in 2009 added further strain, intensifying his sense of isolation. Rather than seeking consistent medical help, Duerson adopted increasingly dangerous behaviors. He drove recklessly, ignored personal safety, and resisted treatment, reflecting a mindset shaped by years of playing through pain. Pride and self-reliance, once assets on the field, became barriers to recovery. Depression deepened as professional opportunities slipped away and personal relationships fractured. He understood something was wrong, yet lacked a clear path forward. In February 2011, at age 50, Dave Duerson ended his life by suicide, deliberately preserving his brain for scientific study. Subsequent examination confirmed chronic traumatic encephalopathy (CTE, a degenerative condition linked to repeated head injuries. His death became a pivotal moment in the national discussion about football safety. Duerson's story reveals that self-harm is not always sudden. It can emerge from years of silent damage endured in the belief that strength means suffering alone. Chris Lighty. Chris Lighty was one of the most influential architects in modern hip-hop, a behind-the-scenes force whose decisions shaped careers and entire eras. Rising from the Bronx, he founded Violator Management and guided some of the genre's biggest names negotiating landmark deals that changed how hip-hop artists were valued in the mainstream industry. Known for sharp instincts and relentless work ethic, Lighty projected control, confidence, and resilience. To the public, he represented success earned through intelligence and endurance, rather than spectacle. That drive, however, came with an unforgiving pace. By the late 2000s, the industry Lighty helped build was shifting rapidly. Digital disruption, declining record sales, and constant negotiation pressure intensified his workload. Days blurred into nights filled with meetings, contracts, and phone calls, leaving little room for rest. At the same time, his personal life was unraveling. A prolonged divorce beginning around 2011, combined with reported multi-million-dollar tax issues, created a level of stress that success could no longer offset. When a person becomes the pillar everyone leans on, who absorbs the weight when cracks begin to form. Rather than slowing down, Lighty pushed harder. Exhaustion became routine, sleep irregular, and alcohol increasingly present as a coping mechanism after long days. Friends later described periods when he withdrew completely. Phones, unanswered appointments, missed communication cut off. Isolation, once a brief escape, turned into a pattern. The pressure of maintaining authority in a high-stakes environment while privately feeling overwhelmed eroded his emotional stability. In August 2012, at age 44, Chris Lighty died by suicide following a family dispute. His death shocked the music world not because of scandal, but because it exposed how deeply hidden his struggles had been. Lighty's story challenges the assumption that power equals protection. Self-harm, in his case, did not stem from public collapse, but from years of internalized stress, overwork, and silence. His legacy remains foundational to hip-hop, yet it also serves as a reminder that unchecked pressure can quietly dismantle even the strongest minds. Nina Simone. Nina Simone was one of the most formidable voices of the 20th century, an artist whose music carried both technical brilliance and moral force. Trained as a classical pianist, she fused jazz, blues, soul, and classical traditions into a sound that was unmistakably her own. Songs like Mississippi Goddamn and Four Women transformed performance into protest, positioning Simone not just as an entertainer, but as a cultural conscience during the civil rights era. On stage, she appeared commanding and fearless, a figure who seemed to draw strength directly from confrontation. Behind that authority, however, Simone lived with profound psychological turmoil. From the late 1960s onward, she struggled with what was later diagnosed as bipolar disorder at a time when mental illness was poorly understood and rarely treated with consistency. Intense mood swings, paranoia, and impulsive behavior became recurring patterns. She often isolated herself, severing ties with family and collaborators, and moved frequently between countries, living in self-imposed exile. Alcohol misuse and episodes of self-inflicted injury marked periods when emotional pain became unmanageable. Simone's self-harm did not always appear in obvious forms. At times, it emerged through neglect, emotional withdrawal, and deliberate isolation. There were public incidents of erratic behavior that damaged her reputation and limited professional opportunities. Concerts were canceled, contracts dissolved, and relationships fractured. Her anger, rooted in racism, betrayal, and unfulfilled dreams, often turned inward, intensifying cycles of guilt and despair. Hospitalizations became frequent, and stability remained elusive for decades. In her later years, improved diagnosis and medical support brought partial relief. Though health issues persisted, Simone regained moments of clarity and reconciliation with her legacy. She died in 2003 from natural causes, leaving behind a body of work that remains influential and uncompromising. Nina Simone's life illustrates that self-harm is not always driven by weakness, but by prolonged neglect of mental health. Her story stands as both a warning and a testament. Artistic power does not eliminate vulnerability, and untreated pain can quietly shape even the most revolutionary lives. Don Cornelius. Don Cornelius was a defining force in American television, best known as the creator and host of Soul Train, a program that aired from 1971 to 2006 and reshaped how Black music style and identity were presented to mainstream audiences. With his deep, measured voice and composed presence, Cornelius projected dignity and control. He introduced generations of artists to national television and became a symbol of cultural authority, admired for consistency rather than spectacle. For decades, his life appeared stable, purposeful, and firmly anchored in success. That stability began to fracture in the late 1990s. In 1997, Cornelius underwent brain surgery to treat an aneurysm. Although the operation was medically successful, it left him with chronic headaches and nerve pain that persisted for years. The discomfort was severe enough to disrupt daily life, yet Cornelius reportedly resisted long-term medication, choosing to endure pain privately. As Soul Train aged and eventually ended its original run, the loss of routine and relevance deeply affected him. The world he helped build was moving forward without him. When purpose disappears after decades of structure, where does identity go next? Following a divorce in the early 2000s, Cornelius became increasingly isolated. He withdrew from social circles, limited contact with friends, and spent long stretches alone in his Los Angeles home. Physical pain merged with emotional loneliness, creating a cycle of depression that remained largely unseen by the public. Known for control and self-reliance, he struggled to accept vulnerability or dependence on others. Rather than dramatic outward behavior, Cornelius's self-harm took the form of quiet endurance, untreated pain, withdrawal, and emotional silence. Hospitalizations for exhaustion occurred, but long-term recovery never followed. In February 2012, at age 75, Don Cornelius died by suicide. His legacy remains monumental, but his final years reveal a sobering truth. Self-harm does not always look chaotic. Sometimes it hides behind disciplined pride and the belief that strength means suffering alone. Tina Turner. Tina Turner was one of the most physically relentless performers in modern music, a woman who turned stamina into spectacle and pain into motion. Night after night, she sang at full power while dancing non-stop, often in heels, pushing her body far beyond ordinary limits. To audiences, she embodied survival and strength, a performer who seemed fueled by pressure rather than broken by it. Her image suggested total control, as if exhaustion itself bowed to her will. Behind that forceful presence was a far darker reality. During her marriage to Ike Turner, Tina endured years of documented physical and psychological abuse. Injuries were concealed with makeup and wardrobe, while performances continued without interruption. In 1968, after a particularly violent assault, she attempted suicide by overdosing on sleeping pills. She survived, but the experience reshaped how she related to pain. Instead of confronting it directly, she learned to absorb it, treating endurance as a requirement rather than a warning. After leaving the marriage in 1976 with little financial security, Turner entered another punishing phase. Determined to rebuild her career, she accepted grueling schedules and rehearsed obsessively. She pushed through injuries, rehearsed until her feet bled, and viewed rest as a threat to independence. Physical strain became proof of commitment, and discipline slowly crossed into self-neglect. The results on stage were electric, but the cost accumulated quietly. Over time, consequences surfaced. Chronic pain, joint damage, and long-term health complications followed later, joined by kidney disease and strokes in her later years. Eventually, Turner shifted her relationship with suffering, embracing spirituality boundaries and self-preservation. She died in 2023 from natural causes, leaving a legacy that extends beyond resilience. Tina Turner's life shows that self-harm is not always reckless or visible. Sometimes it hides inside ambition, discipline, and the belief that enduring pain is the only way forward. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was one of the most transformative figures in American comedy, a performer who redefined stand-up by turning personal pain into uncompromising truth. Emerging in the late 1960s and dominating the 1970s, Pryor abandoned polished routines in favor of raw confession. He spoke openly about race, poverty, addiction, violence, and fear, forcing audiences to laugh while confronting uncomfortable realities. His honesty reshaped comedy itself, influencing generations who followed. On stage, Pryor appeared fearless, as if laughter gave him control over experiences that once controlled him. Away from the spotlight, that control often slipped. Pryor's childhood was marked by instability and trauma wounds that success never fully erased. As fame accelerated, cocaine became central to his life, intensifying paranoia, impulsivity, and emotional volatility. He chased danger with reckless abandon, riding motorcycles at extreme speeds and ignoring basic safety. Risk became a coping mechanism, a way to feel alive when inner turmoil felt overwhelming. When humor becomes survival, what happens when the pain behind the jokes keeps growing? In 1980, Pryor's self-destructive spiral reached a shocking peak. While under the influence of drugs, he poured gasoline on himself and set his body on fire. He suffered severe burns across much of his body and endured months of painful recovery. The incident stunned the public and exposed the depth of his internal struggle. It was not spectacle or performance, but a moment of total psychological collapse driven by addiction and unresolved trauma. Afterward, Pryor entered rehabilitation and slowly returned to work, though his health was permanently affected. Years of substance abuse and physical damage contributed to long-term complications, including the onset of multiple sclerosis later in life. His comedy became more reflective, still sharp, but marked by vulnerability. Richard Pryor died in 2005 from a heart attack. His legacy remains unmatched, yet his life stands as a powerful reminder that brilliance and self-harm can coexist, and laughter does not always mean healing. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway was one of the most emotionally powerful voices in soul music, an artist whose singing carried vulnerability, warmth, and deep introspection. Emerging in the late 1960s, he quickly gained recognition not only as a singer, but also as a pianist, arranger, and producer. His solo work and legendary duets with Roberta Flack showcased a rare emotional intelligence that resonated across generations. To the public, Hathaway appeared gentle, thoughtful, and spiritually grounded, a musician whose sensitivity felt like his greatest gift. Behind that artistry, however, Hathaway lived with severe mental illness. In the early 1970s, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that profoundly distorted his sense of reality. Delusions and intense fear began to dominate his thoughts, even as his career continued to grow. He became convinced he was being watched or manipulated, particularly within the music industry. Rather than stepping back, Hathaway pushed forward, working through confusion and anxiety while avoiding consistent treatment. His self-harm did not take dramatic or attention-seeking forms. Instead, it emerged through isolation and neglect. Hathaway frequently withdrew from those closest to him, locking himself in hotel rooms for days at a time and refusing contact. He skipped meals, slept irregularly, and lived in constant psychological distress. Studio sessions became unpredictable, performances were missed, and professional relationships strained under the weight of his condition. Hospitalizations followed, but each return to work placed him back into the same pressures that fueled his decline. In January 1979, while staying at a New York hotel, Donny Hathaway fell from a 15th-floor window and died at just 33 years old. His death shocked the music world and left lasting questions about mental health and artistic pressure. Hathaway's legacy endures through timeless recordings, but his life stands as a reminder that self-harm is not always loud or reckless. Sometimes it unfolds quietly through fear withdrawal and the gradual erosion of a brilliant mind struggling in silence. Al Green. Al Green rose in the early 1970s as one of soul music's most recognizable voices, known for his smooth falsetto emotional restraint and spiritual undertones. Songs like Let's Stay Together and Tired of Being Alone sold millions of copies and placed him at the center of American popular music. On stage, Green appeared composed and effortless, delivering intimacy without excess. To the public, his career suggested balance, grace and control, an artist seemingly at peace with success. That image shattered in 1974 after a traumatic domestic incident that left Green physically injured and psychologically shaken. The experience triggered a profound spiritual crisis. He stepped away from mainstream stardom and became an ordained pastor, believing faith would restore stability. Instead, it introduced a new form of suffering. Green began imposing severe discipline on himself, equating devotion with endurance. He fasted for extended periods, slept little, and delivered sermons lasting hours without water or rest, repeatedly pushing his body beyond safe limits. When sacrifice is praised as virtue, how can someone tell devotion from self-destruction? Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, this pattern intensified. Green balanced preaching with intermittent recording and touring, creating cycles of exhaustion and dehydration. Hospitalizations occurred, yet he minimized their significance, interpreting physical collapse as spiritual testing. His voice weakened under strain. Album releases became irregular and career momentum slowed. What appeared outwardly as religious commitment often functioned as prolonged self-neglect, with pain accepted as proof of moral worth. Eventually, consequences became unavoidable. Declining stamina and health concerns forced Green to reassess his relationship with suffering. Over time, he learned to separate faith from punishment, returning to music with moderation while continuing his ministry. Later performances emphasized preservation rather than proof. Al Green's story reveals a subtle form of self-harm, one rooted not in recklessness, but in denial of basic human limits. His life reminds us that endurance alone does not define strength. True resilience often begins when pain is no longer treated as a requirement for purpose. Phyllis Hyman. Phyllis Hyman possessed one of the most elegant and emotionally controlled voices in soul and jazz music. Rising in the late 1970s, she became known for her rich contralto, flawless phrasing, and dignified presence. Songs like You Know How to Love Me and Living All Alone turned her into a quiet icon, admired for restraint rather than excess. On stage, Hyman appeared composed and unshakable, delivering heartbreak with calm authority. To audiences, she represented sophistication and emotional maturity. Behind that polish, however, Hyman carried deep psychological pain. She lived for years with severe depression and bipolar disorder conditions that were poorly understood and often stigmatized at the time. As her career advanced, she placed increasingly high expectations on herself, equating worth with performance. When projects underperformed or industry support weakened in the early 1980s, Hyman internalized the disappointment as personal failure. Instead of seeking sustained help, she withdrew, cutting off close relationships and isolating herself emotionally. Her self-harm unfolded gradually rather than explosively. Hyman worked through exhaustion, accepted demanding schedules, and relied heavily on prescription medication to manage sleep and anxiety. Alcohol became a frequent companion. These habits dulled pain temporarily, but deepened her dependence and emotional numbness. Friends described periods when she disappeared for weeks, unreachable and withdrawn. Even as her music continued to resonate, her private world narrowed, shaped by loneliness and untreated illness. In the early 1990s, her condition worsened. Professional opportunities slowed, reinforcing feelings of invisibility and despair. Hospitalizations occurred, yet lasting stability remained elusive. In June 1995, at age 45, Phyllis Hyman died from an overdose of prescription drugs, officially ruled a suicide. Her death shocked fans who associated her voice with control and grace. Hyman's life reveals how self-harm can hide behind elegance and professionalism. Pain does not always look chaotic. Sometimes it wears poise. Her legacy endures through timeless recordings, but her story remains a sobering reminder that emotional suffering, when carried alone, can quietly become fatal. Halle Berry. Halle Berry's rise in Hollywood is often celebrated as a triumph of perseverance against long-standing barriers. Beginning in the late 1980s, she transitioned from modeling to television and film at a time when opportunities for Black actresses were limited and heavily scrutinized. Every role required exceptional effort, constant visibility, and physical discipline. To the public, Berry embodied determination, someone who outworked expectations and refused to disappear in an unforgiving industry. That determination, however, came with a cost she carried quietly. Early in her career, Berry was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, a condition demanding careful balance, rest, and monitoring. Instead of slowing down, she intensified her schedule. Long filming days, little sleep, strict training routines, and pressure to maintain a flawless image became routine. Berry later acknowledged that during this period, she often ignored warning signs from her body, treating exhaustion as a necessary sacrifice rather than a serious risk. When ambition demands constant sacrifice, how does someone recognize the moment discipline turns into self-neglect? Emotional strain compounded the physical toll. In the early 1990s, Berry experienced profound loneliness and depression following personal and professional setbacks. She has spoken openly about a period when suicidal thoughts emerged, revealing how deeply pressure and isolation affected her mental health. Although she did not act on those thoughts, the experience marked a critical moment where success and self-harm stood uncomfortably close. Rather than pausing to recover, Berry immersed herself further into work, using non-stop activity as a shield against emotional pain. Even as her career reached historic heights, culminating in her Academy Award win in 2002, the pattern of overextension continued. Injuries, fatigue, and health complications followed. Over time, Berry began redefining strength, choosing boundaries, responsible health management, and openness about mental well-being. Halle Berry's story shows that self-harm does not always look dramatic or intentional. Sometimes it appears as chronic overwork, ignored illness, and emotional suppression. Her journey reminds us that endurance can build success, but without balance, it can quietly become a form of harm. Ken Griffey Jr. Ken Griffey Jr. entered professional baseball carrying a weight few teenagers could comprehend. As the son of a respected MLB veteran, he was expected not only to succeed, but to surpass a legacy already admired. Drafted at just 17, Griffey reached the majors before most players finished college. His talent was undeniable: effortless swing, natural confidence, and immediate impact, but the pressure surrounding him arrived just as quickly. To fans, he looked fearless. Internally, the strain was far more complicated. Early on, that pressure translated into harmful coping. As a teenager, Griffey experienced a moment of emotional overload that led to an aspirin overdose, an incident he later acknowledged as a reckless cry rather than a planned act. Though he recovered and continued forward, the episode revealed how unprepared he was for the expectations placed on him so young. Instead of slowing down, Griffey leaned harder into intensity, using physical punishment as proof of worth. As his career accelerated, self-neglect took quieter forms. Griffey trained aggressively, often playing through injuries that would sideline others. Wrist, hamstring, and knee issues accumulated, but rest felt like failure. Off the field, he sought adrenaline through high-risk activities, including extreme sports, treating danger as an outlet for stress. Pain became familiar, even grounding, reinforcing a belief that toughness meant endurance without complaint. By the early 2000s, the consequences surfaced. Chronic injuries disrupted seasons, limited availability, and altered public perception. Critics questioned his durability, unaware of how long his body had absorbed strain without recovery. Emotional fatigue accompanied physical breakdown, forcing Griffey to confront limits he had long ignored. Eventually, maturity brought perspective. Griffey began speaking openly about pressure, mental health, and the unseen costs of early fame. Though injuries prevented him from fully sustaining his prime, his legacy remains historic. 6 of 30 home runs, Hall of Fame induction, and generational influence. Ken Griffey Jr.'s story shows that self-harm does not always appear intentional. Sometimes it begins as pressure carried too early, expressed through overwork, risk, and silence. His journey reminds us that even gifted athletes need space to grow, not just physically, but emotionally. Tamar Braxton. Tamar Braxton built her public image on volume, confidence, and emotional honesty. As a singer and reality television star, she became known for her powerful voice, sharp humor, and fearless willingness to expose personal conflict on camera. From her early music career to her breakout success on Braxton Family Values, Tamar appeared unfiltered and strong, someone who thrived under attention rather than shrinking from it. To audiences, she seemed emotionally resilient, even confrontational, as if pressure only amplified her presence. Behind that visibility, however, Tamar's life became increasingly consumed by internal strain. Reality television blurred the boundary between performance and private pain, turning personal struggles into public narratives. By the mid-2010s, non-stop filming schedules, online criticism, and constant comparison within her famous family began to take a toll. Instead of stepping back, Tamar leaned further into exposure. Social media became both outlet and weapon, where late-night posts, public arguments, and emotional confessions intensified rather than relieved distress. When pain is processed in public, does attention heal it or deepen the wound? Her self-harm did not take traditional forms, but it was persistent. Sleep deprivation, emotional overextension, and online conflict became daily patterns. Tamar admitted to staying awake for days, arguing with critics and reliving personal trauma in real time. Marriage difficulties and a highly public divorce compounded the pressure, leaving her feeling isolated despite constant visibility. What appeared as drama to viewers was in reality a prolonged cycle of emotional exhaustion and self-punishment. In 2020, Tamar reached a breaking point when she was hospitalized following an overdose during a period of severe depression. She survived and later spoke openly about her mental health struggles, therapy, and the danger of ignoring warning signs. The incident marked a turning point, forcing her to slow down and reassess how much of herself she was sacrificing for relevance and validation. Tamar Braxton's story shows how self-harm can exist in plain sight. It does not always look silent or hidden. Sometimes it appears as constant exposure, emotional labor without rest, and the belief that staying visible is the same as staying strong. Fantasia Barrino. Fantasia Barrino rose to national fame in 2004 after winning American Idol. Her voice, instantly recognized for its raw power, gospel roots, and emotional depth. Coming from poverty and hardship, her victory was framed as a classic American success story. Audiences saw strength, resilience, and gratitude, a young woman who had survived adversity and turned pain into music. Her early albums sold well, and her performances carried a vulnerability that felt authentic rather than polished. Behind that success, however, Fantasia struggled under pressures she was never given time to process. Sudden fame brought financial responsibility, public scrutiny, and unresolved childhood trauma all at once. As a single mother, she carried guilt, exhaustion, and fear of failure while trying to meet expectations placed on her overnight. Rather than slowing down, Fantasia pushed harder, accepting demanding schedules and emotionally draining performances, often treating exhaustion as penance rather than warning. Her self-harm emerged through emotional self-punishment and toxic relationships. Fantasia later acknowledged that she stayed in damaging romantic situations because she believed she deserved suffering. Public scandals intensified shame, while private guilt deepened depression. In 2010, following intense emotional distress and family conflict, Fantasia was hospitalized after an overdose of prescription medication. She survived, but the incident revealed years of internalized pain that had gone unnoticed behind her powerful voice. Instead of immediate recovery, Fantasia continued to punish herself through overwork. She returned to the stage, quickly performing through vocal strain and mental exhaustion. At one point, prolonged stress led to temporary voice loss, forcing cancellations and confronting her with physical limits she could no longer ignore. Relationships suffered and isolation grew as she withdrew emotionally to protect herself. Over time, Fantasia began reframing her relationship with pain. Through therapy, faith, and self-reflection, she learned to separate accountability from self-destruction. Her later work reflects stability rather than survival. Fantasia Barrino's story shows that self-harm does not always look violent or impulsive. Sometimes it appears as guilt-driven endurance, the belief that suffering is owed. Her journey reminds us that healing often begins when pain is no longer mistaken for proof of strength. Cheslie Kryst. Cheslie Kryst appeared to embody modern excellence. Crowned Miss USA in 2019, she was not only a beauty queen but also a licensed attorney and television correspondent. Intelligent, articulate, and visibly driven, Kryst represented a new standard, someone who balanced ambition, service, and public visibility with apparent ease. To audiences, her life seemed meticulously built: elite education, national recognition, and a fast-rising media career in New York City. Behind that polished image, however, pressure accumulated relentlessly. After relocating to New York, Kryst maintained punishing schedules that often stretched well beyond standard workdays. Legal work, television appearances, public speaking, fitness, and image maintenance competed for the same limited hours. Rather than slowing down, she internalized the belief that rest equaled failure. Perfection became expectation, and expectation quietly turned into self-imposed punishment. When success demands constant excellence, where does a person place their exhaustion? As months passed, isolation grew. Friends later described how Kryst masked fatigue with positivity while privately struggling with anxiety and depression. The comparison culture of social media intensified feelings of inadequacy despite outward achievements. Instead of seeking sustained support, she withdrew emotionally, choosing independence over vulnerability. Risk-taking behaviors emerged, including solitary adventures and physically demanding challenges that pushed her limits, offering momentary control amid emotional turmoil. Kryst spoke openly in essays and interviews about battling depression, particularly the fear of not being enough as time moved forward. She acknowledged the mental toll of maintaining an image of constant success. These admissions revealed a woman deeply self-aware, yet still trapped by internal expectations she could not release. Pain, rather than being addressed, was managed through endurance and silence. In January 2022, at age 30, Cheslie Kryst died by suicide. Her death shocked those who saw her as a symbol of empowerment and progress. Kryst's story is a stark reminder that self-harm does not always arise from failure. Sometimes it grows in the shadow of achievement, where pressure replaces compassion and suffering is mistaken for strength. Behind fame, talent, and historic achievements, these stories expose a truth many prefer to overlook. Success does not erase pain. It often magnifies it. For these figures, self-harm rarely looked chaotic or reckless. It appeared through silence, overwork, endurance, and untreated emotional wounds hidden behind excellence. Their lives challenged the belief that strength means carrying everything alone without breaking. So the real question becomes this: do we truly celebrate Black excellence? Or do we quietly reward suffering as proof of worth? If pressure, not failure, is the greater danger, then what responsibility do industries, audiences, and fans carry in recognizing the cost of greatness? This is Legends of Black Excellence, where honoring legacy also means confronting the uncomfortable truths behind it.